Hello all, it's Tom. Now, today I wanted to talk about an introduction into oil painting and what oil painting is. Now, over the years, I've noticed there's a segment of people who become intimidated or almost scared, put off by the suggestion that they try oil paint. Or they say, I want to try oil paint, I'd like to try oil paint, I don't know where to start, there's so much information, how can I begin to think about using it? And it is a big thing. It's something which a lot of people have very, very strict ideas about. There's a particular method, there's a particular way. I want to work in the style of. You can't do this because. Now, that kind of has me thinking about authenticity. And I'll often talk about authenticity, especially when painting, because for me, my painting practice is so much a part of what I am and who I am. It is my identity. And so that sense of authenticity is a very strange thing in the modern world. We live in a time where a lot of what we consume is increasingly digital, and with the advent of AI, or the promise of what AI can do or could do, you're increasingly left to wonder whether what you are seeing or reading or consuming is legitimate. Now, if you want to go and set yourself off on a painting practice, do not do it on the basis for social media likes. Do not do it on the basis of, I will make money out of this. Do not do it for any other reason initially other than to say, I'm exploring a facet of myself. You're exploring who you are, and in that way you won't set yourself up for disappointment. And that does not mean that you won't then expand into making money from your art. It doesn't mean that you won't be able to have a following on social media, but do not set out for that to be your goal, because that is not a way to build a painting practice. Okay. And similarly, don't get put off by the things you see on social media. So you will often see people working in a particular way, people extolling one particular method of working, that it's the correct way of working, that you should only work in this way. It does not work in that way. Oil painting, and oil paint is a tradition, and that tradition has evolved continuously across hundreds and hundreds of years. Now, the way in which we paint in modern times, that's quite different to how the historic methods of painting were. But even then, there was not one way. There were several schools and many different ways of working, and things developed independent of one another or were passed down. Now, around about the 18th century, you'll see shifts in working. And just to illustrate what I mean by there was no particular way of working. If you've ever heard of Sir Joshua Reynolds, he was a very famous English painter in the 18th century, and he was the first president of the Royal Academy. Now, by the time he was working in the 18th century, earlier knowledge of the system of oil painting and methods of working had been lost. What I mean by that is he spent a lot of his time collecting paintings, old master paintings, paintings which were, he liked Rembrandt, he really enjoyed Rembrandt, and he spent a lot of time trying to understand how Rembrandt painted. Now this on the timescale of oil painting is minuscule. So Rembrandt he died around 50 years before Joshua Reynolds was born. So we're talking a very small amount of time in which knowledge was lost. Reynolds spent a long time acquiring paintings, and there are accounts of him at the time, and there are technical analysis now of paintings which are known to have been owned by Reynolds that have been reworked. He would purport to restore them. What he was actually doing, he was stripping them back layer by layer, trying to understand how artists working 100 years before Reynolds worked, because that knowledge had been lost. There was a shift in how the materials were understood, how the materials were used. There was a fascination with the idea that there was a particular way of working, and often it would purport to include resins and other miraculous mediums that really didn't make much of a difference or weren't widespread in use. So Reynolds was quite an experimental painter, and a lot of his work now is quite difficult to keep in one piece, because he would often he'd pick apart old master paintings, but he would also experiment within his work endlessly. So even back then, there was this constant need for new knowledge, new information. So don't be put off when people say there is one way of working, because it is not the case. What I would set out to do, and in some respects we're quite lucky in this day and age, because we have technical information through science which wasn't available to earlier generations of painters, where we can pick apart what's going on in paintings and old paintings. We have the knowledge of hundreds of years to be able to say something may outlast a particular way of working. And that presents opportunities. So in my work, I like to experiment a lot, but the thing I really enjoy is pushing paint to its limits. What you might consider bad working practice fascinates me. For that reason, Joshua Reynolds fascinates me, because he was at the time, the top painter. You know, if you wanted a painting, you'd go to Reynolds. But his work has just fallen apart often because he just experimented. So it's really this tradition that you are part of when you're a painter. You don't work in isolation, and the understanding of materials, what set the earlier painters up for success, was that they inherently knew the properties of their materials. And so this was done through a system of apprenticeships. You went into an artist's workshop, you were apprenticed into an artist's workshop before you even got the chance to lay your hands on a paintbrush and paint. You'd be taught the basics, you'd be taught how to grind paint, you'd be taught the differences in pigments, what they did. There would be basic principles with which you would have to adhere to within that workshop. And that would be dependent on the artist, on the master that you would study with. And that relationship shifted and has continued to shift to the present day, because often artists working today, they don't have that relationship with their materials. They consume the materials, right? They don't necessarily understand what goes into the materials. So my advice to you, if you are setting out on a journey of discovery through paint, get to know your materials, get to know what you're buying. And in the basic sense, that means, what do we understand as paint? What do we understand as oil paint? Now, around about 1840, there were big developments within art materials and paints. You had the introduction of something called the triple roller mill, which was, before then, pretty much artists would make their own paint by hand, or they would buy paint that wouldn't keep because collapsible tubes weren't a thing. They'd often be stored in pig's bladders, and the air would slowly oxidise the oil paint, so it wouldn't be something that would keep. So often you would make your paint. And so the triple roller mill allowed companies to manufacture larger quantities of paint, and the introduction of collapsible tubes came around at a similar time frame. What that meant was, for the first time, you would have access to materials and colours that you did not need to grind, you did not need to know, and you could buy off the shelf in a shop. And so this sense of knowledge, what the artist should know, was not so important anymore, as long as you understood what the paint did and how you might want to use it for your needs. That was the important thing. Now, the problem with that, number one, you lose the knowledge, so you're not as intimately understanding your materials as you might do. And the other thing is, you are taking for granted the word of the manufacturer, that this particular paint contains this particular pigment. And often you might find that a colour had been adulterated with something else to make it go further, to cheapen the paint, to fill it out. So when we're talking about paint, you might expect, if you go and buy a tube, it's going to be paint, right? What is paint? It's essentially pigment. So a dry powder, a coloured powder, and an oil. And by oil, it will be a drying oil. So what's termed as a drying oil. And what happens is the drying oil will have a chemical reaction, so it will oxidize. And through that oxidization process, it will polymerize. So you get this paint film. Now, in oil paint, a lot of the time, you will have linseed oil. Linseed oil comes from flax, same stuff that you get linen from. You get it from the flax seeds. And so in an ideal world, you'd perhaps want oil and pigment. And you can do that. If you make your own paint, you can do that. It won't necessarily keep as well over a longer period of time, but in a lot of commercial paints you will get a few things. You'll notice a few things. First, you'll notice the price. So they're set up in series. So different series as you go up will have different costs associated with them, and that's down to the quality of the pigment and the amount of pigment that's in the paint. So you might notice some paint that's relatively cheap. It will be probably termed as student or entry-level paint. You might also notice some very expensive, or what you might perceive as very expensive paints, which are professional or artist grades. Now, the difference between those, often I'd get students and they would be conscious of their money because they're students, but what that would mean is they'd have a fondness for painting in acrylic because it was seen as more accessible. They would shy away from oil paint even if they wanted to paint with oil paint. They'd shy away from it because of the perceived cost. Now what you have to understand is with oil paint, if you buy good quality oil paint, a 40 milliliter tube of oil paint, good quality oil paint, will contain so much pigment that it will go extremely far. Now, I paint relatively thick in pasto. I still have tubes of really good quality paint that I've had for 5 or 6 years. 40 milliliter tubes are not very big. And they last because the pigment load is so great that when you're mixing colour, you only need a tiny amount. Now, if you've got something like a phthalo blue, like Bob Ross's favourite, phthalo blue, that is so potent that even mixing a tiny bit of it can completely ruin the colour mix that you're after if you're not careful when you're using professional grade paint. Now, if you're looking at student grade paint or entry level grade paint, it will handle differently because it won't have as much pigment in it. What happens is, instead of having oil and pigment, you'll have oil, pigment, and you'll also have something called a filler or an extender. Now those things can be things like chalk. You'll get different things depending on who's manufacturing the paint. But the important thing is, what happens is the extender or the filler will take the place of the pigment in bulking out the paint. So when you've got a very powerful pigment like a phthalo blue, you can bulk it out and it'll still do its job, but it won't have the same potency as an artist grade paint. Now, with commercial paint, with modern commercial paint, you'll have usually, even in very good paint, you'll usually have a stabilizer, and that might be wax, that might be aluminium stearate, something that will keep the suspension of the paint so that it has a long shelf life. So I've got paint down here that's probably 30 years old. It's older than 30 or 40 years old. It's older than I am, and it still functions because it's been manufactured in a way that the shelf life is increased. Manufacturers will go to great lengths to try to homogenize their range. So when you're looking at a range of a brand, it'll become a very personal thing for you, because you might not like brand X, you might like brand Y, and the reasons for that can be loads of reasons. One of the things that often comes up is that it's got a buttery texture. That if the texture of the paint is buttery and it's smooth and it brushes very beautifully, that can often be something, a perceived quality of the paint that's sought after. Now, all pigments handle differently, so you have to understand that for the manufacturer to get that across all of its range, they will need to do some tweaking to their recipes and their formulas, and that might include adding particular things into the paint to give it a particular. When it's buttery, when you consider the paint to be buttery, often the paint will be short, and by short, it brushes nicely, but it doesn't have a pull. Okay. It can often be stiff as well. So a short, stiff paint, that is generally the benchmark by which good paint, or a lot of commercial paint, is judged by these days. Now, you might get manufacturers of paint who aren't interested in that necessarily. What they're interested in is the quality of paint. So often what you might find in smaller manufacturers of paint is they won't use stabilizers at all, or they might use a very, very slight amount, and they certainly won't use anything like a filler or an extender. Now what that means is sometimes you can have some very nice quality paint, but the shelf life isn't necessarily the greatest, and it certainly probably won't last the extent of a lot of the larger commercial oil manufacturers. I've got paint from very, very respected companies, some really interesting pigments, and you can often tell whether it's got any rubbish in it or not, because sometimes the pigment doesn't always want to stay stabilized with the oil, and what will happen over a period of time is you might get some oil that leaks out. So if you open a tube of paint and you'll notice a bit of oil that comes out, and it looks like pure oil, there's no pigment in it, it's because the oil is trying to separate away from the paint. Now you don't want a huge amount of that. That'd be disastrous. But often what that means is you've got a relatively nice paint there because there's nothing in it that's rubbish. I suppose the question is, what are you after? What do you want from oil paint? it is such a broad craft and a broad tradition that you can use it in ways that you probably can't even anticipate. And that presents opportunities. What I mean by that is that if you know your materials and you know what the paint is that you're using, you can achieve things which will surprise you. Now that takes a bit of practice, and there are certain approaches in painting which will drastically change how you work with the paint. If you're applying paint next to paint and it's opaque on a surface and you don't generally rework it, maybe you move on to the next area, that would be understood to be direct painting. And a painting might take you a good while to finish. It might take you many sessions, but you're putting colour next to colour or on colour. You might be mixing on the surface or on your palette or a bit of both, but essentially there's no layering going on. That would be understood to be direct painting. And that is more of a contemporary way of working. You go back to the Impressionists, they would use that way of working. That was something that was really came about because of the invention of tubed paints. It let you have a whole range of colours that you might be able to use, the potential of colour, and you could go mad with it. Now, before that, when you had to grind your paint, grinding paint takes a while, right? It's quite laborious. You get a different quality paint, it'll react differently. So if you are looking to paint in a what might be termed as a more traditional method, if you're more interested in portraiture from the Renaissance or something like that, if you're interested in Titian, if you're interested in Rembrandt, if you enjoy the old masters, you have to understand the paint you will be using in tubes is nothing like the paint that they would have used. You might get the same pigment or a similar pigment. It won't react the same because it is fundamentally different in how it's manufactured. And the trade-offs and compromises in tubed paint, in manufactured paint, that pressure is not there when you're grinding your own materials. The way they would paint, it wouldn't be direct, it would be indirect painting. What I mean by that is that they would paint through layers and structure and knowledge of how the picture plane works to get the most out of their materials. So if you have something like the sky in old paintings is fantastic because skies are generally blue. If you look at an old painting and the sky is grey or a browny grey, that will be because the artist will have been glazing. So glazing is a transparent body of colour over an earlier layer of paint. So the earlier layer of paint will model the surface, and then you would add colour on top. It's almost like tinting a black and white photograph. Now that sky will have gone grey or brown or a dirty, horrible colour because the artist would have most likely have been using something called smalt. And smalt is a glass, it's a blue glass, cobalt. And that would get ground up and it would be turned into paint to tint the sky blue. and it's a beautiful colour when it's fresh. Unfortunately, it doesn't last, and it degrades over time. It's a fugitive colour, right? Something that disappears or alters or fades. And that happens, that would have happened because the painting, the artist that was painting would have had to have made a balance with their knowledge and the materials that they had at the time. Because smalt was a synthetic blue used in place of genuine ultramarine, which comes from a stone. And it's an extremely expensive process to get genuine ultramarine. Now, it's a beautiful colour, and it doesn't go grey and it doesn't go brown. You will know if you look at an old painting, and it's got spectacular blue. It's got a spectacular blue. It will be genuine ultramarine. But it's expensive. And artists knew their materials, so they would try to work around what would be the limits of that craft at that time. And we're really lucky in that respect, because we have access to incredible materials that they just didn't have access to in many respects. But we've also lost the knowledge a lot of the time in what these materials can do. If you have ever visited a museum and you've seen an old painting and it seems to glow, right? It's like looking into someone's eyes when they've got light coloured eyes, like blue eyes. It just seems to take on a life of their own, right? That glow often is a process that they worked in of having an underpainting and a series of glazes on top of that, coupled with a final varnish, which would enhance the colour saturation. And what happens is the light comes into the painting, and each transparent layer, the light goes in, bounces off. You look at this and it just absorbs light. Those paintings just absorb light in a way that direct painting where you're laying opaque colour on top of each other or next to each other, the light can't penetrate that, so it doesn't glow. And so sometimes it can feel a bit dull. So really, if you're wanting to explore painting, you're wanting to explore oil paint in particular, get to know your materials, because it will set you up to experiment and to expand into areas which you can't anticipate currently. And once you're comfortable doing that, right, and once you know what's in these paints, and once you know maybe you like a particular colour, that could be very liberating. Going back to the sense of authenticity, paint because you want to discover something. Paint because there is a need inside you to fulfill something which doesn't exist in your life currently. Paint because you don't know what's at the end of it. That will lead you to discoveries, and that will lead you to things and opportunities and knowledge which you can share with others. genuine knowledge, something which isn't, it's not a short reel on social media that will capture your attention for 5 seconds and leave you. You know, we live on a very odd rock that's hurtling through space, that rotates around a gigantic ball of fire. It's absurd, right? Life is absurd. So with the time you have, explore that absurdity and see what you can bring to it. So don't consume, right? Don't just endlessly fill your mind with junk on social media. Make and create and contribute to everything which is good and beautiful in the world. And you will find something, I promise you, you will find something that is deeply, deeply fulfilling.